long time ago. Would have been early 90s in the UK. I used to go up to an outward bound centre up in the Lake District that had canoeing, caving, climbing, all sorts of outdoor activities, and climbing was one of those activities. And I mean it just grabbed me like it does most people when they first get into the sport. So so everything kind of rolled from there, really. A really easy slab, and obviously on top rope, and but that and obviously in trainers, and didn't have a chalk bag or anything like that. Like I said, this was early 90s. I mean, they didn't really have climbing walls back then, so you can kind of guess how old I am. But I didn't have the opportunity to get into the sport via a climbing wall, because obviously that whole scene was sort of gradually evolving, and I didn't have anybody to get me into climbing either. So initially I'd save up pocket money and pay a climbing instructor to take me out, and that's how I was able to actually start climbing outdoors when I was about sort of 12 years old. So I didn't do as much climbing perhaps as someone getting into the sport initially can now. Back then it was very much a case of you, because it was all trad as well, it wasn't sport climbing, you had to know someone who was already a climber, and they would then kind of take you out and gradually sort of mentor you, and then that way you'd sort of get into the community and meet other people. So a much sort of longer way of getting into climbing these than current times, for sure. So I was born in Bristol, which is in the southwest. So all the gritstone in the UK is in the north. There was some coastal climbing, but it's mainly all inland and all limestone. So the good thing with Bristol is that it's unique in having a big natural limestone gorge on the edge of the city that's about 80 metres, sort of 250, 260 feet high. And so that was very much the epicenter of climbing in Bristol. And I mean, like you just sort of turn up sort of 6 o'clock in the afternoon, bearing in mind that, with the UK being in the Northern Hemisphere, you get long summer evenings. It doesn't get dark to sort of 9 o'clock. And you just kind of look and see if there was someone by themselves who was also looking for a partner. And you just sort of go up, introduce yourself, see what they wanted to do, what you wanted to do. If that worked out, can you lead? Do you have any gear? One person would usually turn up with a 9mm rope, and the other person would have another. And I mean, like in some respects, it's kind of a miracle most people survive, because obviously you don't know whether that person can belay safely at all, or what their ability is like to put in trad gear. And you just off you go, and if you sort of survived and you got on with that person, then you probably swap numbers and stay in touch, and that was kind of how it evolved. It was very, very different, very, very different. Did quite a few trips there. I mean, there was quite a big Bristol contingent that would go across, because it was only sort of 2.5 hours drive from Bristol. Some of the best trad climbing in the UK, for sure. Actually, it's pretty. I mean, for the harder routes, definitely. So when you're sort of kicking, sort of E4, E5 and up. But I mean, even a lot of the E5s, E6s, and some of the E7s are actually kind of quite well protected. I mean, there are notorious routes like Souls and Huntsman's Leap, which are very, very run out. I mean, on the whole, it's actually really quite well protected. Stunning scenery as well. I mean, it's just massive coastline. So it's really, I mean, just sort of looking around now, I mean, it's such a unique place. I mean, I've been living and developing climbing areas in Asia for sort of the past 20 years, and initially my introduction into Asia was through Thailand, which is quite different to China, and it's different to Malaysia, and obviously Vietnam and other East and Southeast Asian countries. But what makes Hong Kong so unique is its accessibility of the climbing, the quality of it, a significant enough quantity, and the variety with such an impressive city as a backdrop. You don't need a car to get to any of these crags. I mean, Monkey Buttress, where we're now, is less than 5 minutes walk out of a taxi. So that makes it very unique compared to a lot of other Asian places to climb. I mean, Thailand's got fabulous climbing, but it's really a destination kind of place. Or if you live in Thailand, you still need a car to get around. It doesn't really have the same concentration of routes. I mean, that's a unique aspect that you don't find anywhere else. Everything in my early sort of climbing career, so sort of starting from really transitioning from just going to an outward bound centre where you're doing lots of outdoor activities to actually learning climbing and taking it on as your own sort of personal activity. As I said, it was very much a case of a trad background first rather than sport later, and I guess inevitably with trad there is an element of pushing your own boundary within that, and I didn't necessarily always do well protected routes. Done a few British E7s where you fall off the crux and you're definitely going to hit the ground. Some routes that by their very nature they're graded for that. But I mean, I can remember in Pembroke having to abseil into the sea. That was a long story. A route down in Cornwall, an E4 that kind of just didn't really approach with the right mindset, which was, a very, very thin, technical, very run out steep slab wall route, where you just needed to be very kind of relaxed and zoned into finding your route up this slab without kind of deviating off the line too soon. And it was basically about 120, 130 foot single pitch with a sketchy start, which we were in a rush basically to try and get the route done before before the light faded, and I kind of threw myself at this route when you needed to be sort of warmed up, relaxed, sort of thinking and being very sort of deliberate and cautious, and sort of just like, I've got to get on this, we're running out of time. It's like it's the wrong mindset for that kind of route. And so I fell off the first crux and decked on rope stretch. So at that point went, right, okay, it's going down, so a bit too headstrong, and sort of pulled the rope, sort of got through that and got committed. And there's good gear at half height, but then you've got a sort of a 30 foot run out section from the gear, so you're looking at a sort of pretty much you're getting on for a ground fall from about 80-90 feet, and you follow this sort of diagonal line of scoops with no gear, so you're sort of stepping up into these scoops, shifting, and then stepping up into the next one. So it's okay, it's doable, provided you just stay calm and focused. And then you have to break out left from the scoop line, and I remember sort of breaking out and doing a move which I couldn't reverse, and I'd stepped up into a position where I couldn't reverse the move, and because I'd stepped up too soon, it was blank, so I couldn't climb up. I couldn't reverse it without a very good likelihood of falling off, and it would have been a really serious fall. and I couldn't jump off because I had no protection to fall onto. So I ended up having to untie, and it was just myself and my partner. So I basically had no choice. I was either going to have a very serious fall, potentially hitting the ground because my partner couldn't run backwards. I mean, it was a mess actually. So I ended up getting him to tie a knot. He took me off belay completely, tied a knot in the left-hand orange 9mm. I untied the other green right-hand rope, dropped it, and just had to sort of stay there in balance and wait. And he grabbed that 9mm and ran round to the top of the crag, set up a belay, and then sent down the tail with a figure of 8 and a screw gate in it. And of course, I was sort of lying there, and it's like, no, it's too far to the right, and you're doing your best to stay calm under those circumstances. But eventually got it down and clipped in, and it's like, right, can I sit on this now? And he's like, yeah, it's safe. And it's just like, oh. So that's probably, a bit sweaty hands. I mean, that's probably the sketchiest situation I've been in, because serious trad routes. I mean, you can go out sometimes and just have a gibbering kind of like day out and kind of send it, but really, you need to be very calculated and very tactical in how you approach them. That's a good example of not having been sort of kind of mentally ready for it, and that kind of sticks in my mind a bit. yeah.
Has that affected?
I have a very different perspective on each style. I mean, my whole climbing origin was trad first and sport later, because I mean the whole sport climbing boom really kicked off in the 90s when when Moon and Moffat and all those guys came back from France and started to apply that whole kind of siege into a red point sort of ethos back to the UK. That eventually trickled down into sort of sport climbing for the masses. But to start with, you'd only really find a sport route on really hard stuff. And so my background was very much trad first, because the availability of lower grade sport routes like below 7C, really below 8A, didn't really come about until the mid-90s. So my whole philosophy with trad is that there's a much higher or wider scope of risk involved, whereas sport was considered, well, that's like the equivalent of supermarket shopping. It's supposed to be convenient and safe, and the whole grading system around it also is about effort. I mean, the French grade system is about effort to get up a route. It's nothing else. It's not risk, it's not danger. So that feeds into my bolting philosophy as well, because if you're introducing what I call designer danger, it's kind of not really consistent with the whole grading system. So I treat it very, very differently in that regard. I grade it with a perspective of the focus is on the climbing. The whole purpose of using a bolt is to reduce the risk sort of envelope, or the risk threshold, to the lowest practical level, such that the focus is purely on the climbing. I know that there's an element, some people equip with a sort of spicy aspect to it, and to an extent that can originate from either the individual's own experience and how they got into equipping, and it can also be the evolution of a particular style. You can go sport climbing in a lot of places in Europe where they're sport crags. I mean, Sirana is a classic example where you've got old school sport climbing where you can in some cases hit the ground from nearly the top of some routes because they're so run out. next to sectors which are like modern day sport crags, and the bolting styles are entirely different, but that reflects, you know, the evolution of how attitudes and equipment and, you know, a whole load of factors conspire to change that over time. But no, when I'm equipping routes, I'm doing it from the point of view of protecting the leader from you know, hitting the ground or hitting a ledge, and really just being able to, you know, work a crux. And I mean, obviously you don't want to bolt 2 feet apart all the way up a route. There's obviously a compromise, there's a balance, but generally, you know, these days it's accepted that, you know, the bolts are at least closer together towards the ground, and you shouldn't be, you know, hitting a ledge and sort of breaking your ankles or something like that, because, yeah, I mean, that's the whole point. You can generally always put the bolt where you want it. So if you're putting it in a position where it's artificially making it harder or unsafe, it's, you know, it's kind of not really in keeping with the whole ethos of what sport climbing's about. Well, it was just curiosity, really. I mean, as I said, everything was sort of the reverse of what it is today, and I guess that the whole trad climbing side of things was, you know, it has a real sense of adventure around it, and I was just really interested in. I mean, people, you know, these days ask me, oh, you know, how do you put up a new route, and, you know, what are the decisions that influence you? And I guess that was the same sort of questions I had when I was sort of, you know, 14, and I was curious about, you know, how people put up new routes, and that whole, I mean, it's very much a sort of subset of the sport. It's very much sort of part obsession and then part paranoia, probably in equal doses. And what really tipped it was the Bristol Climbing Centre opened, and that immediately became a focal point for climbers in the Bristol region to meet. So much like, you know, now you've got climbing walls here, you know, bouldering walls here in Hong Kong that provide that same role. And I'd gone down the wall one particular day, and again, you know, I was sort of 14, didn't have any climbing partners, and I was sort of meeting people just by introducing myself and asking if I could join them. And I happened to meet and start climbing with one of the area developers and co-authors of the Avon and Cheddar Guidebook, Gordon Jenkin. And yeah, you know, I just by chance happened to meet maybe it was fate, I don't know, meet the right person. And yeah, it all kind of snowballed from there, really. Yeah. Yeah, I was very fortunate. I mean, in the sense that you don't know what you don't know, and especially for climbing, which, you know, you learn a lot from other people. I mean, you learn from your own experiences as well, but there's no substitute for, you know, someone who's older and more experienced giving you an opinion or sharing their experiences. But what makes it even more valuable is when they provide the context. I'm very much a sort of firm believer of trying to, you know, explaining the pros and cons and the context behind something, because just saying, oh, that doesn't work, or you should do this, you should do that, is rather meaningless. It's just an opinion. And I was very lucky with Gordon that he turned out to be, you know, a really, really good mentor. And then I also, through him, got introduced to Martin Crocker, who's a very well-known climber in the UK, who's done thousands of FAs on trad and bolts, and between the two of them, I had two of the leading developers in the UK at the time. So yeah, that's how I got into the new routing. That's how I learned a lot about the process, the ethics, the considerations, and yeah, that's how I ended up doing my first new route when I was 14. So yeah, yeah, still remember that quite vividly as well. learning how to put a battery onto a drill. I actually used drill pegs back in the day because I didn't know how to put bolts in, and back then, I mean, it's like, you know, it was like 1993 or something like that. I can't do the math offhand, but yeah, I mean, you know, it was NiCad rechargeable batteries back then. So I remember going to a Brandon tool hire and, and renting this Bosch drill for 2 days, and it literally took 2 days to drill like 7 holes or something, to bang these drill pegs into, because, you know, the battery technology back then was just, you know, it was so, the whole battery chemistry was, you know, so inefficient that it took that long to literally, in the number of recharges, to get all the holes drilled. Yeah, it was quite funny, and, you know, yeah, formative years. There was a real improvement in cordless drill quality and battery chemistry changed. I mean, it made a real impact in the US, for example. I mean, when those guys bolted churning in the wake, which was the first sport route at Smith Rocks, and that was really the first sort of sport route in the US, that had a major cataclysmic change for ethics, and because that kicked off the whole, you know, ground up bolting on lead with a hand drill versus, you know, just rack bolting. And yeah, that definitely had an impact. That's the thing. I mean, when I first started, you know, doing sort of what we call sport routes back in the 90s, it was, you know, largely taking kind of caving spits, which were self-drilling kind of fixing that, you know, really only go in like a 25 mil, and they were hand drilled, and tiny little spreader at the back, and you would, you know, screw in a caving hanger into it, and that really constituted what was, you know, almost considered to be, you know, pretty reliable protection back then, which is, you know, quite scary, to be honest. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a miracle, really. A lot of people didn't kind of have really serious accidents, although, I mean, I think there probably were. But, you know, these days everything's changed to, you know, stainless steel glue-ins, and, you know, you can get like marine grade stainless steel wedge bolts like this, which are actually bomb proof. You can get that for less than the price of coffee. So the range of different types of, you know, titanium and deeper and bigger glue-ins, you know, that the whole range of choice of different types of fixings you can put in is improved. The price has come down, the quality's gone up, the availability. I mean, I worked for DMM for a brief period of time, and this one's been pulled out, but that was the only kind of glue-in anchor you could get in the UK. I mean, as I said, this has been pulled out, so it's deformed, but, you know, that was like nearly £4 back in the 90s, which, you know, these days, God knows how much one of these would cost. So yeah, you simultaneously had the cost of cordless drills come down, the reliability and the performance of them's gone up, they've become a lot lighter, and, you know, bolting technology's radically improved as well. So it's a lot easier for people to develop a Crag, and more people are sport climbing now. That's the way most people get into the sport. So a whole load of aspects of climbing have changed. Yeah. The process of actually putting bolts in that's not really where I mean, there's hard technical skills. So there's, you know, the equipment side of things, knowing what you need, how to use it. I mean, it's all very well knowing how to put a bolt in, but can you even get onto a route to put it in? So, you know, how do you even approach that? Do you rig a top rope somehow and get someone to belay you whilst you get lowered down a route and clean it? Do you fix a static line down it? Do you know single rope techniques? Do you know how to re-belay? I mean, there's the whole sort of aspect of getting onto a route to clean it, to inspect it, to gear it, or even just clean it if it's a trad ascent. There's all the equipment side of things. There's knowing how to put different bolts in. Should I use titanium? Should I use a duplex stainless steel? Should I use marine grade? Should I use a super austenitic? I mean, there's all of those sides of things, and adhesives, but then there's kind of the experience, as the kind of the art judgment side of it. So it's like, there's a crag here, but if I develop it, what impact is that going to have? Is it worth doing it? Is the cost involved as well? And then it's having an eye for a line. Looking at a crag and I can see there's a line there, and knowing intuitively why that will be a good route, which should be common sense, right? Because we know what we enjoy when we go climbing, but translating that onto a blank canvas of an undeveloped crag is a different process, and then it's kind of knowing where to put the bolts as well. But the biggest transition, I'd say, in closing, is when you go climbing with someone else, it's you're making decisions that affect just you and yourself. When you equip a sport crag, the decisions that you make in that process affect everybody. And also the consequences for that, your own decisions, can also boomerang back onto you as well. And that is a real distinction between just going climbing and actually developing. I've been new routing for 30 years now almost, and the biggest issue really, aside from corrosion of fixed protection, probably the biggest impact on the other sort of impact on sport climbing that's been significant is access issues, and ironically, that's probably the most difficult aspect of development. You can find someone who can teach you how to put bolts in, and ideally you do that through a mentor process, and you can learn all of that aspect, but the one thing that you can't easily control is access and the impact of what other people are going to do, and also it's having that awareness that when you're developing a crag, it's maybe only you and maybe a few other people initially, but then over time that expands to hundreds, potentially even thousands of other people. Ironically, that's the aspect of development that is often overlooked and dealt with further down the track rather than up front. I've sort of grown up seeing crags, closed permanently, and access issues. I've done voluntary work for the British Mountaineering Council and been involved in sort of area bolt debates and policies, and that's definitely probably the biggest sort of threat to climbing these days. It's loss of access. Look at Taiwan, for example. They have bird bans. A certain times of the year, parts of Longdong are closed to climbers because of nesting birds. We don't have any of those kind of restrictions here. There's no requirement for you to sort of have a permit system like they introduced here for mountain bikers. That's since been withdrawn, but it has been we've been in a very fortunate position of a relatively small outdoor user group not having any restrictions placed upon us, and it is a concern that moving forwards we have definitely stepped away from that as a climbing community. The extent to how much we are going to be affected moving forwards is an unknown quantity. A number of reasons. I guess mainly born from the fact that over the past 20 years in developing new areas throughout Asia, I've always gone to an area, sort of been, part of a development team or just, being the developer. And there's always been this sort of cycle of opening a new area and, people come in and it's fantastic and it's great. And then, I sort of go and that's it. And I guess with Hong Kong, I've wanted to bring a different aspect to the whole sort of sport climbing topo thing. Firstly, coming from a very sort of traditional climbing background, the whole acknowledgement of developers and the history of how climbing's evolved in a given location is, to me, quite important, because it provides the sort of the landscape for why the sport's developed in the way it has. But it's secondly also, I've always, from my upbringing, the sort of recognition for developers has always been a key part of the kind of climbing culture, and that extends to trad developers as well. It's not just a sport thing, and I don't think that hasn't, to the best of my knowledge, really been addressed. And Hong Kong was very much a springboard for the evolution of sport climbing throughout Asia. I mean, when Todd Skinner, Sam Leitner Jr. and then Paul Piena and these, those guys from the States came over in the early 90s, what Todd then went on to do in Yangshu and Vietnam with Paul Piena and things like that, that really started sport climbing in Asia. And obviously there's been, a lot of other people involved, in Hong Kong at that same time, but then also within East and Southeast Asia afterwards. So the guide, touches on that, and also, it includes a lot of unpublished routes as well and new areas. So those were the main sort of driving reasons for it, and the fact that there wasn't a printed guidebook here, and that, kind of largely, I think, will sort of put Hong Kong on the map as well. I've focused only on sport climbing. I'm not a boulderer, and there are other people in Hong Kong that are far more better equipped to write a bouldering guide, or indeed, do anything online for that. So that was the first criteria. Second criteria as well, it's got to be a proper sport route, so nothing mixed. So if you need trad gear along with there's some bolts on it, it's a mixed route. It's not going in the guide. And then I also sort of whittled out the odd crag that's only got 2 sport routes on it, that's in kind of like the middle of nowhere and you need a car. So that was the sort of main criteria. And then I also wanted to check every single route that went into the guide. So that meant abseiling all the individual lines, getting bulk count for each route, and actually sort of dropping a tape down to get an accurate sort of pitch length. So really providing sort of quite sort of detailed, holistic information, and then combining that with a sort of topo style, but an also old school kind of trad guide style as well. Yeah, it's a survey tape, 30 meters. Yeah. Some might sort of laugh at, having that information, but, there have been quite a number of people in the last couple of years have popped off the end of a rope here. So, it's kind of handy to have that sort of information, if only to know what sort of rope to bring to Hong Kong. I mean, I had someone email me 2 days ago, they're flying in, what rope length should I bring? I mean, writing the guide has taken me about 2 years. And in part that's because of a lot of development in the last year, but also just the time involved to, go up to Kowloon Peak and spend a couple of days dropping everything to check out the state of bolts, where the lines actually go, how many bolts are on a pitch, is it, you know, got any particular risk that someone should be aware of, and, you know, how high is it? And yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of time. I mean, there's obviously different ways of sort of finding out the information, but certainly with the historical, that's sort of taken quite a bit of time. I mean, using the pictures of Todd Skinner on his trip here in 1992, that was quite involved. I mean, I knew a UK climbing magazine that's not running any longer, On the Edge. They had done an article in Hong Kong back in the early 90s, and it took a year to find someone who had an entire back catalogue, and then they kindly actually went through hundreds of magazines to find the article that Todd Skinner and Sam Leitner Jr. had written on climbing in Hong Kong when they came through. So then I managed to get out a copy of the magazine. I believe that one of the photographers, Jacob, was last in Thailand, and I'm not even sure if he's still alive. So then I had to go through some communal friends in the sort of international bolting community to track down Sam Leitner Jr. and then get his approval. But then that whole process meant that I got some other pictures of people climbing on Tech Wall in 1992, you know. So yeah, it was fun. And hopefully it'll do justice to, you know, a whole plethora of people who've been involved in the development of climbing here, from you know, 1990s to present day. Yeah, about how much I don't know about design software. I mean, I've learned an awful lot about the whole process. I mean, it's one thing to actually write a guide, but it's a whole new world translating that into a finished product. And yeah, I mean, it's been quite a sort of challenging process, but also, yeah, really interesting as well. I mean, I've learned a lot more about photography. I mean, I'm not a photographer, but learned a lot more about that and sort of design software and the printing process, and there's proofing. Yes, proofing. I wouldn't wish proofing on my worst enemy, but yeah, I mean, that you know, there's been, you know, three times where it's reaching for the phone, stop, don't print, you know. So yeah, that's been a sort of self-discovery, but there's a few little surprises in the guide as well, for other people to discover. I mean, people may not know about, you know, the bomb at Black Crag and yeah, the mining around one of the new crags on Lantau. So yeah, that's all. You know, some people may not be interested in that, but yeah, I mean, developing a new crag and pulling out a World War II unexploded mortar round is something that, yeah, I don't know many people have encountered in developing a new crag, and I kind of think that's kind of sort of, you know, yeah, it's just interesting, isn't it? Especially considering the people involved survived to be able to tell the tale. Yeah, and it went off with quite a bang the next day, apparently. So, yeah. Yeah, bomb disposal called up the next day. Yeah, there's pictures of that in the guide. Yeah, thanks to Jim Gray for that. Well, yeah, I mean, there's... I won't obviously give the entire game away. There's been quite a lot of development in the last year. I mean, certainly not just by myself. There's other teams here, but I guess some of the highlights are there's two sort of new climbing areas in terms of that are significant in terms of the quantity of routes. So there's a new area on Lantau which has got 74 new routes, and one sector in particular has some really absolutely fantastic low-grade sixes that are 30 meters long, and there's a few routes that you need a 70-meter rope for. sort of 3-star 6As racked one next to the other. And then there's the other sort of other significant new area, by quantity of routes. It's on the Kowloon side, and a highlight of that is a 7-pitch 140 metre long route, which it's got a real sort of adventurous feel to it. It's got a couple of pitches of hard climbing on it, nothing too desperate, but overall the rest of the climbing's quite amenable. But it's 140 metres in length, so it's the longest continuous vertical route in Hong Kong, and it's got quite a unique top out. So I think that'll prove to be quite popular, and it's very easy access. It's only 12 minutes from the road. So, and then there's a lot of other areas as well. It's a really nice new wall down at To Tai Wan by the sea. There's more developments at Sheko. There's more developments on Kowloon Peak. And a whole load of other additional stuff. It's a new 6-pitch route on Tung Lung. I've done quite a bit of rebolting there, which I mean, people are aware of Kite Rock being rebolted, but I've also rebolted some other areas, which I haven't talked about yet. There's some surprises in there. Although the cost of bolts has come down over time, fundamentally someone's still got to pay for it. In some countries you've got like access funds, or so like US you've got the access fund, France you've got the FFME, you've got in Germany you've got the DAV, you've got the German Alpine Club, you've got associations, you've got funds which developers, if they're kind of checked out and approved, can access those resources to equip their own routes. In Hong Kong we don't have that, and really all the development is really been born out of the pocket of the person who's put the route up. So largely I've had to self-fund everything, and that's kind of one of the reasons I've become a distributor in Asia for Titan climbing and bolt products. It it allows me to feed my own passion at a lower price, but all the developers here have had to basically pay for stuff themselves. I have used sort of crowdfunding. I'm more reluctant to do that these days because of part of the aspect of new routing is that you need to sort of maintain a degree of secrecy, both to sort of prevent against loss of your own equipment. I've had a lot of gear stolen, but also to sort of protect against other climbers, because you may not have completed the cleaning of a route, but you've maybe for various reasons put the bolts in, or there may be hazards, or you just haven't finished the whole place. And if you crowdfund, then there's a sort of, to an extent, there's an obligation that, well, at a minimum, people know that you're developing something. And I think it comes back to having to self-fund everything, and it can get expensive for sure. Okay, so that's a different sort of set of circumstances. So a bolt fund where you're asking the community to cover the costs of replacing existing bolts on existing routes. It's an altogether different scenario, I look for contributions to cover that work. I keep, it's very informal, but I keep a record of where the money's been used, so that, and in that case, the decision will always be made to use the highest possible standard of of the fixing the bolt that's going to go in, because it's a bolt fund, and you're using other people's money for a kind of community use. So to me, you've definitely got an obligation to those people who, and to the wider community who are contributing. Well, it's just a very sort of casual. People either contact me or post on the Bolt Fund page on Facebook, or just either see me at a crag or send me a message, an email or a WhatsApp, and depending on what the issue is, then it may be rebolted, it may not. I mean, there's obviously a whole set of sort of subset of politics around re-gearing routes. So even if someone wants something re-geared, there has to be there are additional sort of steps involved with that as well, and that obviously is in itself a sort of sensitive topic. Basically goes back to covering my own personal expenditure on. I mean, the last year I've added a few hundred new routes, and I mean, looking at my records, I've placed in the last year 1,350 bolts in the past year. So that adds up to kind of quite a bit of money, especially when you include the adhesive, rags for cleaning it, drill bits and mixer nozzles, and the odd rope because it's got trashed, and getting to a crag, it does add up. I mean, of course that's spread out over time, but and being a distributor, I obviously get trade prices for fixings, but it still does add up. But I mean, a lot of the significant costs in the guide have gone in design costs. I mean, I'm not a designer. I don't have the capability to take a 100-page long Word document and actually turn that into a book. And then of course there's the printing costs as well. So I mean, granite's great because it generally involves very little cleaning, and when you sort of get to my point in new routing, you get a bit sick and tired of having to clean things. So it's that's what's great about Asia. Back in the UK, you're getting a crowbar out all the time. You've got gardening gloves on, and so granite tends to be much cleaner. But then the issue is that it also tends to be quite blank in the way that volcanic tuff, which is the other dominant rock type here, doesn't suffer the same fate. But then the geological aspect of volcanic tuff is that it's very, very jointed, which means you can get superb, very crisp knife edge edges, but it can also be horribly loose as well, which in itself can also make where to place bolts that much more technically involved. An extension of the reasons of why I established new routes in the first place, and that is to put something back into a sport that's given me a lot personally, and really kind of sharing a resource that everybody's got access to. I mean, obviously I don't necessarily always get it right. Everybody sort of makes mistakes in maybe how many bolts they put in a route, or a grade they give, or something like that. But fundamentally, when it comes to establishing sport crags, the intention is to provide a resource to the climbing community that that people can go and enjoy, have a great time, and makes them happy basically. And that's what new routing has given me, the fun of developing a new area, and people are going to love this one, and sharing that with other people. I mean, people put up new routes for different reasons, but that's certainly what motivates me. It's great, isn't it? I mean, it's the same feeling you get when you go on an overseas climbing trip and you turn up in a crowd and go, oh wow, like what's that line? And you're straight to the guidebook and you want to find and then it's like, oh it's 8B plus, all right, whatever. But it's great when it turns out to be a 6E plus or like something else. It's that excitement of the basic aspects of why you go climbing, but then being able to create that for other people. It's partly the risk. I mean, that sounds a bit strange after we've sort of just spoken all about sport climbing and mitigating risk, but I mean, it was very much, it still is a driver in terms of, there is still risk associated with sport climbing, obviously, but I mean, it's a very sort of zen activity. It's a great way of, staying healthy and having a motivation to stay healthy. I love being outdoors and the whole sort of movement. I mean, I did a lot of different sports when I was younger, but climbing has really sort of stuck with me all this time, and it's also very sociable as well, and it's great to be outdoors. Yes, use glue-ins. I don't know. I mean, it's quite ironic, that I mean, I'm very much about embracing the responsibility of developing new routes and the impact that your decisions have on other climbers. It seems quite ironic that I look back in the 90s on the sort of utter grot that we were putting in, sort of like little 8mm bolts and sort of drill pegs and Portland staples, and things have changed a lot in the past few decades, but that's the thing, that's all we had back then. It was kind of sort of had unrealistic sort of levels of reliability attributed, that today it's different, but I don't think I would have changed much. No. Yeah, they can buy my guide by going online, www.hongkongrock.com, and then that'll take you straight through to the web link. Also, on the Hong Kong Rock Climbing Facebook page, there's been a post there, but the easiest thing is to just go to hongkongrock.com, and then that'll take you straight through to the portal. I guess a thank you to people who have supported my development in terms of new routes, and people who've posed for climbing shots, and the community within Hong Kong that have supported the Bolt Fund. But also, I mean, I'm very, very grateful, obviously, for the support of my wife Donna, and also my mentors, Gordon and Martin back in the UK. Without the support of those kind of people and the greater community, that makes a real difference in what you can get done. So always very sort of cognizant of that. Climb hard.